Welcome back to our ongoing and continuing study in the Gospel of Matthew. The original Greek word euangelion, which is translated into English as gospel, comes into English, in fact, in two distinct forms. The word gospel, in terms of its English history as a word, goes back to Old English. But we also have the underlying Greek word euangelion, which we translate as gospel. The word euangelion simply means good news, comes into English in the family of words such as evangelical, evangelism. And that word euangelion comes into English as EV instead of EU, because if you are familiar with Latin, the U is often seen as a V. Matthew chapter 26 and beginning at verse 65, reading down to verse 68. I'm reading from the Orthodox Study Bible. And like any study Bible, when you get past the secondary material, the underlying thing is just a basic Bible translation. In this case, it makes use of the New King James Version, a version that dates from the 1970s, if I remember correctly. Matthew chapter 26, beginning at verse 65. The high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard of his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving death." Then they spat in his face, beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" One of the things that we like to pride ourselves on in the evangelical community is that we are people who believe in evangelism. We have identified as one of the key works of the church is the work of evangelism. Yet, when we use that word, do we really mean that we are sincere in doing evangelism? Some of the most difficult people to convert to the Christian faith are people in the church. Evangelism in the evangelical circles, though, is often focused on reaching outside the church, to people who are outside the church. Evangelism is where we bring the faith to bear on a person's life. And that does not matter whether the person is in a church, active in a church, involved in a church, or whether that person has no use for the church and is outside the church. Evangelism is never easy, for evangelism ultimately means we have to overcome barriers in people's lives. Now, a person outside the church has a particular set of barriers, but even a person within the walls of the church can have barriers. That person can have the barriers of family. They have a history within the denomination, and they do not want to somehow infringe on that image. So they can have several denominations, and they can see that the church is just simply a part of their heritage. They have no desire to make a commitment. They're already a part of the church. And in some cases, their grandfather might have actually built this church. They can have the barrier of biblical knowledge. How could they be outside the faith? They got the Bible memorized. They know all 66 books, and they might have hundreds of verses memorized. They can have church title and position. Why do they need to convert? I'm a deacon, I'm an elder, I'm a pastor, whatever. They can be people with extensive circles of friends in the church. Why do they need to make a faith commitment? I'm already widely accepted and liked in the church. You see, evangelism always requires us to overcome barriers. Those barriers are what we have to overcome if we want to make the gospel applied to people. And of course, what happens is often the gospel is pushed back, shut out because of barriers. If we want to understand the conviction of Jesus by this group that met in Caiaphas' home and the judgment that he deserves death, then we need to keep the first paragraph in mind. The people who did Jesus in were the church folk. Now, in order to keep their hands clean, they allowed the Romans to do the actual dirty work. Look at those people in that room who condemn Jesus, and you see people with a family heritage, biblical knowledge, church title, and people who would attest to their commitment to the work of the church and the institution of the church. The point is that the people in this room would not be seen in the same light as those pesky pagans called the Romans. You see, these were very fine religious folk, and they had absolutely no problem, and I'm pulling on the plug on Jesus. The life of the church is not for the faint of heart. The life of the church is not always heaven on earth. The life of the church can be a very difficult place to live out the faith. Yet the church also needs people who can witness to the reality of the saving faith of Jesus Christ. In the church, there are need for people who can live out the faith. For there are people who need to hear and encounter the reality of the gospel. Jesus did not get crucified because of what he believed. Yes, what he believed was offensive to those people, but understand it was not that which led him to be crucified in that sense. Jesus was crucified because he challenged the cabal, CABAL, of religious leaders to actually be the people they were wanting to be seen as. It is that challenge that led to his death. Is the church always corrupt? Is the church always filled with leaders who bring it shame and not glory? The answer to both questions is no. There is always a but here, though, and that is huge. We can say no, but the church and its leaders are not automatically without falling and failing to be the people of God. Evangelism in church history is often linked to church renewal. In simple terms, we're saying if the faith is real to the church, then evangelism becomes possible and effective. And so when you look at periods of church renewal, they lead to evangelism. Why? Because the faith becomes real in the life of the church. I call this bucket theology. If we're trying to do evangelism out in our community and we do not have a full bucket because the faith is not really real to our church, how effective will we be? But if our bucket is filled to overflowing and sloshing as we carry and go forth out from the church into our community, we will impact that community for Christ and for his sake.